a whisper from the fire, a scent that shouldn't linger, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Somewhere between love and silence, a secret smouldered, waiting for time to draw it back into light. This is a tale of ash, memory, and a question no courtroom dares answer. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. Let's begin the story. It was in the fading days of October, when the light died early and a damp grey fog settled along the window panes of Baker Street, that Holmes entered one of his more introspective moods. The fire crackled low in the grate, casting flickering shadows upon his thin, angular face as he stood unmoving before the hearth, hands clasped behind his back, his eyes unseeing but unmistakably calculating. Outside, the muffled clatter of hooves and distant whistles of cabmen were swallowed by the thick London air. There had been no case for a week, and Holmes, like a violin left untouched too long, seemed strung with restless potential. I had attempted, in vain, to rouse him with trivialities from the Times, but he had only waved me off with a slight twitch of the eyebrow. It was a silence I'd grown to recognise, not disinterest, but hibernation. The mind, I knew, was sharpening in the dark. Without warning, Holmes crossed the room and drew from a drawer a small wooden box, within which he kept samples of tobacco ash, Burmese cigar, Trichinopoly cheroot, Egyptian blend. With the delicacy of a jeweller examining rare stones, he began comparing ash under his lens. "The difference, Watson, is as plain as the nose upon your face," he remarked absently. I bit back a retort. His tone was not mocking, merely scientific. I watched him with a curious mixture of admiration and pity. The great detective, reduced to classifying ashes to keep his mind from devouring itself. The city, it seemed, had no puzzles left to offer. Then came the knock, a gentle, uncertain tapping, no louder than the rustle of a turned page. Holmes froze mid-movement, one eyebrow arching like a signal flag. "Not the landlady," he said softly, "and certainly not Lestrade. Listen," the pause between the second and third knock. Hesitation, apprehension. I moved to rise, but Holmes was already at the door. The hinges creaked open, revealing a figure entirely shrouded in black, veil, gloves, coat. Her silhouette seemed cut from morning cloth itself. She remained still, as though awaiting judgment. "Pray enter," Holmes said, his tone suddenly formal. "You are expected, though you do not yet know why." As she stepped inside, I caught a faint and curious scent. Not of London coal smoke, nor perfume, but something warmer, foreign. Orange blossoms. It struck an odd contrast against the sombre cut of her attire. Her gloves were buttoned to the wrist, yet a subtle crease revealed they were worn not for warmth, but to conceal something. Holmes gestured toward the settee, but she remained standing, her face still veiled. I noted the faint tremble in her left hand, which she tried, with great discipline, to still. Holmes, meanwhile, regarded her like a book newly opened and already halfway read. She removed her veil with slow, deliberate motion, revealing a face both beautiful and drawn tight by worry. "My name," she began in a low, accented voice, "is of no importance. Not yet. I have come, not to solve a crime, but to prevent a truth." Holmes leaned forward, eyes narrowing with sudden interest. "That, madam, is a request both paradoxical and irresistible. I am not afraid of the law," she said, "but there are things buried in the past that, if exhumed, would harm the living more than punish the guilty." Holmes only smiled faintly. "Now that is a case." I glanced at Holmes, and he at me. A single look exchanged across the gulf between logic and sentiment. His eyes glittered not with empathy, but with intellectual engagement. I knew that look well. She had said enough. The machine had started. The great engine of Holmes' mind had found its fire. The woman remained standing, her gloved fingers laced before her as though holding some invisible weight. She spoke in measured tones, her voice laced with a softness that did not quite mask the strain behind it. "My name," she said at last, "is Signora Bianca Santoro. My sisters and I arrived in London 6 weeks ago from Naples, following the passing of our guardian, Signor Arturo Santoro. He was our uncle by blood and our protector by circumstance." Holmes gave a small nod, but said nothing. He was a collector of art and of secrets. His death was said to be an accident, a fall, but there were whispers. And one man in particular has not let them rest. "Whispers have a way of growing legs in narrow alleys," Holmes murmured. "And which alley has this one run down?" She hesitated. "To our doorstep." I leaned forward slightly, but she continued with a subtle shake of her head. "We live now in Kensington, quietly, under another name, but the past has not remained where we left it. I do not seek protection, Mr. Holmes. I seek delay. I ask that you leave it buried." Holmes steepled his fingers. The game, I saw, had already begun. "It is Lord Pelum," she said, and with that name, the room seemed to contract. Holmes raised an eyebrow, but his voice remained calm. "The Pelum family holds certain positions: Parliament, trade, scandal, depending on which generation one consults. He came to Naples often," she continued, "under the guise of antiques, but it was not urns or oil paintings he pursued." There was a tremor then, not in her voice, but in the restraint with which she controlled it. "He had dealings with my uncle. Letters were exchanged. I believe he now possesses some of those letters, and he threatens to make them public unless you pay." Holmes finished for her, not unkindly. She nodded once. "But it is not the scandal we fear. It is the resurrection of what the fire was meant to consume." I turned to Holmes, bewildered, but he was no longer looking at her. He was staring past her as if seeing a shape emerge in the fog. "I must admit," I said, "I cannot quite comprehend your choice. Why hide your name? Why not appeal to the authorities?" Bianca turned to me then, and there was no bitterness in her smile, only weariness. "Because the law cannot unburn what has burned, Doctor." She explained that the three of them, Bianca and her younger sisters Lucia and Teresa, had taken rooms under the surname Brescia. Their uncle's will had left them a modest but sufficient inheritance, enough to live quietly. They had told no one they were in England. Not even the Italian consulate knew of their arrival. The lie, she said, was not meant to deceive. It was to allow us peace. Holmes finally stirred. And yet peace has a peculiar habit of drawing attention, especially when cloaked in mourning and mystery. Her gaze dropped. "We did not expect him to follow us. We were wrong." Holmes rose then and crossed to the window where the fog pressed gently against the glass. "You are not the eldest," Holmes said without turning. Bianca looked up sharply. "I beg your pardon?" "You are not Mariana," he continued. "You are the middle child. The brooch you wear bears the crest of Santoro. Yes, but worn lower than tradition dictates for the firstborn. Your gloves show a faint burn on the right index finger. A domestic injury, I'd wager, from hastily removing a kettle from flame. That is not the task of a head of household, but of one who bears the burden when the head is absent." I blinked. Holmes, really? But Bianca had not denied it. If anything, her silence affirmed it. "She does not reside with you," Holmes continued, now facing her. "Or else she is hidden. There is something between you three that shifts the weight unevenly." Bianca's eyes flashed, but she said nothing. Holmes, however, did not need her words. "There is guilt in your stance, madam, but not shame. A curious combination." Her voice was quiet. "The dead have their place, Mr. Holmes. It is the living who find it hardest to stay still." Holmes merely inclined his head. "Then it is the living we must observe most carefully." Bianca's composure, though carefully maintained, was beginning to fray. "There are things I cannot say," she whispered. "Not because I do not trust you, but because I have promised others not to speak." Holmes folded his arms. "You've come to the one man in London who can uncover truth from silence. And now you ask him to remain still?" She stood, glancing briefly at the fire. "My uncle's death was ruled accidental. There was no inquiry. The only witnesses were myself, my sisters, and the maid. And the maid—" "Yes?" Holmes asked. "She left Naples the very next day. We have not seen her since." I felt a prickle along my spine. "You believe she was paid to disappear?" "No," Bianca said simply. "I believe she knew something she feared would destroy us." Holmes paced once slowly. "And you came here to ensure that I would not be tempted to pursue this?" "Yes." He stopped. "Which means, of course, that there is something to pursue." She did not answer. She only closed her hands tightly, as if pressing closed the lid of an old, dangerous box. "I have told you more than I intended," she said at last, retrieving her veil and drawing it slowly over her face. "And yet, not enough for you to act, I trust." Holmes inclined his head. "You have given me something far more valuable than a confession, madam. You have given me contradiction." She paused at the threshold, her gloved hand on the doorknob. "Please," she said softly, "if you value discretion over brilliance, let it lie." Holmes gave no promise, nor did he bid her farewell. Farewell. When the door closed, the room seemed to exhale. I looked to Holmes. "Are you truly going to let this one slip past?" He walked to the fire, then returned to his seat. Fingers steepled once more. "She came seeking silence, Watson," he murmured, but her footsteps echoed louder than any scream. And in that instant, I knew that no plea could silence the thing Holmes had already decided to follow. Holmes lit a fresh cigarette and gazed upward at the curling smoke. "She is not afraid of scandal, nor of ruin," he said. "She is afraid of resurrection, a truth presumed dead that now scratches at its own coffin lid." "A fourth sister?" I ventured. He nodded. "Or a memory made flesh." I shivered despite myself. "And what of Lord Pelum?" Holmes gave a dry smile. "A man of influence, undoubtedly, but even the powerful leave footprints when they think they walk on clouds." He turned his gaze to the window, where the fog pressed steadily on. "Watson, we are not hunting criminals. We are hunting a truth someone loved too much to bury." I could not help but ask, "And what do we do if that truth refuses to stay buried?" Holmes tapped ash from his cigarette. "Then we follow it, even if it drags us all the way to Naples." Holmes's mind, once engaged, moved with a velocity I had long since ceased attempting to match. Within 24 hours of Signora Santoro's departure, he had acquired 2 separate correspondences, one from an old legal acquaintance in the Neapolitan judiciary, and another from a linguist friend with ties to an Italian medical bureau. We sat in the study that evening, Holmes reading aloud the dry phrasing of Signor Arturo Santoro's death certificate. Cause of death, cranial trauma resulting from descent of staircase. Witnesses, 3 nieces and domestic maid, name unlisted. Convenient, I remarked. Indeed, Holmes replied. But consider, 3 witnesses, all familial, and 1 domestic, now untraceable. No post-mortem, no formal inquiry. Naples may have charm, Watson, but it is not immune to omission. I reviewed the attached letter which mentioned the steps where the uncle had supposedly tripped. A marble staircase, worn but clean. Holmes tapped the page. Worn, yes, but not uneven. One does not simply fall to one's death without a stumble in the narrative as well. You suspect foul play? I suspect that a man like Santoro does not fall so easily, in masonry or in reputation. And if he had secrets, Watson, I dare say they were pushed. His eyes gleamed as he rose from his chair. We shall examine who stood behind him, and who stands to gain from his fall. The next morning brought word from Naples, or rather, the lack of it. Holmes had written to an associate at the Ministry of Health in Rome, who returned with alarming brevity. No additional testimony, no statement from the maid, no autopsy requested. The only living witnesses, it seemed, were the Santoro sisters. Extraordinary, Holmes muttered, scanning the letter. A disappearance not of one person, but of process. The maid, I began, vanished or removed. I frowned. You think she was silenced? Holmes leaned back. More likely bought. A single servant with first-hand knowledge of a mysterious death. A dangerous liability to anyone with secrets or guilt. He retrieved the original household registry, supplied by our contact in the Naples consulate. There, neatly scratched out in faded ink, was the name. Alessandra Lupo. No address, no forwarding record, no known relations. A ghost. It's all too tidy, I said. Precisely, Holmes replied. When records become immaculate, they cease to be honest. He folded the documents carefully. Santoro's death may not be our central mystery, Watson, but I suspect it is the rope from which the other threads begin to unravel. Later that day, while Holmes pored over foreign registers and shipping manifests, I pursued a simpler thread, Lord Pelum. Though his name appeared only fleetingly in London society pages, I found several notations in art trade ledgers, indicating recent excursions to Naples, Venice, and Florence, all within the previous 18 months. One entry in particular caught my attention. Private consignment, ceramic bust, Greco-Roman origin, arranged by L. Pelum, Westminster, via Naples. When I relayed this to Holmes, he nodded slowly. Antiquities are the refuge of men with refined tastes and unrefined dealings. Smuggling, forgery, bribery. The antique trade offers all of them, provided one speaks fluent Latin and keeps poor ledgers. You believe Pelham's interest was never statues? His interest, Holmes said, was human. Whether in business or affection remains to be seen. I felt a curious chill. Bianca mentioned letters, scandalous ones. Holmes raised a brow. Love letters, perhaps, or blackmail bait. Either way, Pelham returned to England with more than marble. He pulled down a dusty volume on Roman forgeries. We shall pay a visit to an old chemist friend in Soho. If Pelham left residue in Naples, he may have tracked it in through our very streets. The apothecary at the corner of Greek Street and Old Compton was a narrow man in both frame and temperament. His shop smelled of lavender oil, sulphur tinctures, and something faintly metallic. Holmes greeted him in fluent Italian, and the man, recognizing an old customer, or perhaps an old debt, inclined his head. "Signor Holmes," he said, "I thought you had long ceased dealing in Neapolitan disorders." "I have," Holmes replied. "Now I deal in Neapolitan women." This produced no more than a lifted brow. Holmes slid a slip of paper forward. On it were 3 names: Bianca, Lucia, and Teresa Brescia. The apothecary nodded slowly. Yes, they came for medicinal oils, lavender, valerian, and tincture of opium, though only once. Under those names? Holmes asked. They paid in coin. No account. Did they mention their uncle? No, but one of them flinched when I said Napoli. He tapped his temple, like a bruise touched. Holmes said nothing more. Outside, he muttered, "The false name confirms their need to vanish. But valerian and opium, that's not for disguise. That's for sleep, or perhaps for someone who cannot sleep at all." I looked at him uneasily. "And someone," I added, "who is not mentioned." That very afternoon, Holmes proposed a walk. "For the benefit of your circulation," he said, though I knew perfectly well whose health he had in mind. We found ourselves loitering not far from Kensington Gardens, across from a quiet terrace with ivy, strangled gates and lace-curtained windows. Holmes nudged me with his cane. "Observe, Watson, 6 houses down, west side, the man in grey." The fellow stood near a lamp-post, hat low, coat unremarkable save for the shoes. polished, spatted, and entirely too clean for a London curb. He made no move toward the house, but neither did he stray from it. "A spy," I whispered. Holmes squinted. "More likely a watchman, but not for protection. His left foot always angles toward the gate. That is not caution, it is intent." As we passed closer, Holmes dropped his glove. He stooped, retrieved it slowly, and in doing so, took in the man's hands. One gloved, one bare, and the faint bulge of a folded note in his inside pocket. "Not a professional," Holmes murmured. "Too nervous. And not Italian. The shoes speak Bond Street. We are being observed, Watson, but not by friends." That evening, Holmes stood over the dining table with a half-dozen note cards and clippings arranged like soldiers on a map. Each bore a name, a date, a correspondence, or a deduction. Bianca, Lucia, Teresa, Santoro, Pelum, and in the centre, one card left blank. "There should be a fourth," Holmes said. I blinked. "A fourth what?" "Sister," he replied. "All documentation, the will, the household record, the Neapolitan census refers to Arturo Santoro's 4 nieces. Yet in every recent mention, there are only 3. Perhaps the 4th died young." Holmes tapped a clipping. "There is no death record, no gravestone, no obituary. And when Bianca spoke of her sisters, she listed them too smoothly, as though rehearsed. I considered, could she have been disowned? Possibly, or disfigured, or hidden. But a name erased leaves a shadow, Watson, especially if it once stood in sunlight." Holmes produced a torn envelope retrieved from the apothecary's dustbin, addressed not to Brescia, but to Signorina M.S. The initials, I believe, stand for Mariana Santoro. "The eldest?" I asked. Holmes nodded. "And the one not spoken of, which makes her the most important." He leaned closer to the table. "If I am correct, Watson, then we are no longer dealing with a case of blackmail. We are dealing with resurrection, the kind no family welcomes, and no criminal survives." Holmes's pursuit of truth does not often require footsteps, but on this occasion he followed them, specifically those of Lord Pelum, whose polished boots led us on a dull, grey morning to the far end of Limehouse. Here, amid the fading remnants of old trade halls and weather-worn warehouses, stood a narrow building with a sign so faded it might have never existed. Archivio Privato Italiano. Holmes, having adjusted his collar and donned a peculiar grey cravat, a detail I thought purely aesthetic, waited until Pelum had entered, then gestured for us to proceed at a safe distance. Through slatted doors we glimpsed rows of aging parchment, bound ledgers, and frail scrolls stacked like sleeping corpses. Pelum remained at the rear, speaking to an elderly clerk in a blend of English and poor Italian. Holmes murmured, "He seeks to erase a ghost, or retrieve it." Moments later, Pelum exited with nothing in hand but an envelope. He passed us with a glance, and the faintest flicker of recognition, but Holmes offered nothing in return, save an idle whistle. Once inside, Holmes produced a silver sovereign and placed it into the clerk's palm. "Mariana Santoro," he said. "All that remains." The clerk vanished briefly, returning with a brittle folder and a weary look. "I had thought her gone," he said. "But the Englishman, he asked for the same name not 5 minutes before." Holmes nodded. "Yes, but unlike him, I am not here to bury her." Among the documents, one fragment caught Holmes' immediate attention. A torn letter, half charred at the corner. He laid it flat and traced the delicate slanted hand with his finger. "Carissimo LP," it began. "You must understand why I cannot show my face in London." Holmes turned to me. Mariana Santoro, writing not to her family, but to Lord Pelum. The style, the ink. Late last year, just before the fire. I studied the broken phrases. "It reads more as a plea than an affair." "Indeed," Holmes replied. "But note the signature, your M, always. That is not a business arrangement." There followed another slip, a crude inventory of items sent from Naples to a private address in London. Item number 6 was redacted in ink, but Holmes held the page to the window light and murmured, "Photographia, femina, bruciata." "Burned," I said, heart sinking. Holmes nodded. The photograph was destroyed, but not lost. Not entirely. The clerk had offered Holmes a scorched envelope addressed to Casa Santoro. Holmes accepted it with a peculiar reverence. "There is no formal record of her after that," I said. "Which is precisely why she matters," Holmes returned. "A person only becomes invisible when someone else exerts great effort to make her so." And for the first time in this affair, I saw Holmes not merely curious, but disturbed. Back at Baker Street, Holmes worked in silence while I examined the charred photograph that had been recovered from the archive's wastebasket. Not a complete image, but enough to suggest a young woman seated in profile, her features half erased by fire and time. The edges were singed, and the centre had bubbled where the flames had eaten deepest. Who would burn a photograph so carefully as to destroy the face and leave the surroundings intact? I asked. "Someone who wished to erase identity," Holmes answered, "but not memory. A strange kind of vandalism, wouldn't you say?" He turned the photo over and examined the faint imprint on the reverse. Napoli, Via delle Rose, Studio Capello, a modest photographer, now defunct. Next came the letters, or rather fragments of them. Holmes had managed to recover partial pages that referenced London addresses, payments in cash, and hints of romantic expectation. They were emotional, desperate, at times even pleading. "She loved him," I said. "Lord Pelum." "And he, her?" Holmes mused. There was silence between us. "Or perhaps," Holmes continued softly, "he loved the secrecy more than the woman herself. Love, in men of his rank, is often transactional." Holmes retrieved a final scrap of note, mostly illegible save for 2 words. "The child." I stared at him. "There was a child?" Holmes said nothing for a moment, then turned away from the window. "That," he said quietly, "is the part he would destroy at any cost." "And Mariana?" I asked. Holmes replied, "If she lives, Watson, then every lie in this affair becomes not only cruel, but criminal." Holmes did not speak for some time after that. He withdrew into the armchair near the fire and rested his fingertips together, eyes closed, but mind plainly alight. I had seen that stillness before. Not idleness, but a storm gathering behind closed shutters. Finally, he spoke. "She was never dead," he said. "Not for a moment." "You believe the family faked her death?" "No," he replied. "I believe they accepted the fire as erasure. Whether she survived it whole, maimed, or changed in spirit, they allowed the world to forget her, and in doing so, they tried to protect her. Protect her from what? From the world, from Pelum, perhaps even from herself." I could not disguise my disbelief. "You suggest she lives in hiding, that the sisters have kept her secret all this time?" "I suggest," Holmes said, "that they loved her too deeply to bury her in truth, and not enough to let her walk freely among them." He rose then, with new purpose in his step. "We shall test the theory," he said. "If Mariana lives, then someone must be caring for her. A convalescent home, a private retreat, something off the record. And where do people hide the things they can't burn, Watson?" "In places no one wants to look," I answered. Holmes nodded. "Then we begin with those." The following day found me, with great reluctance and even greater confusion, seated in a dusty back room of Weatherby and Sons antiquarian booksellers on Chancery Lane, where I was instructed by Holmes to play the part of an Italian manuscript enthusiast with a particular interest in early Neapolitan folios. The bait, I was told, had been set via a letter from a fictitious collector who claimed to hold certain parchments referencing a nobleman's illicit export of cultural relics. That nobleman, of course, was Lord Pelum. "Do be convincingly vague," Holmes advised. which, given your natural discomfort with forgery, should come rather effortlessly. Within the hour, Pelum arrived. He wore confidence like a borrowed cloak, elegant, but not his own. As I stumbled through my questions about regional dialects and marginalia, he revealed far more than he intended. His tone betrayed familiarity with Naples not as a scholar, but as a man haunted by the place. "There are things in the south," he said suddenly, "that cling to one like incense, charming from afar, but choking when too close." I pretended not to hear, but Holmes, listening behind the adjoining room's wall through a drilled aperture, would not miss the tremor in his voice as he added, "Some ghosts belong in their ruins, Doctor, not in London drawing rooms." And with that, Pelum departed, unaware that he had just walked straight into Holmes's carefully arranged trap. It was nearly a week later when Holmes reappeared after a day-long absence, his face marked by soot, fatigue, and a peculiar stillness I had come to associate only with encounters that left even his formidable intellect shaken. He poured himself a measure of brandy, rare for him, and seated himself beside the fire. "I have found her," he said. "Mariana?" He nodded. "Though she no longer answers to the name, she resides under the care of a certain Dr. Calder in a private facility off Richmond Road, discreet, unlicensed, and home to a dozen patients whose families prefer silence over scandal." I stared at him. "You went inside?" "In the guise of a legal inspector investigating permits," he replied. "It required only a forged letterhead and a modest Scottish accent." He looked into the fire for a long moment before continuing. "She was seated by the window. Her face bears the marks of fire, grotesquely so, but the eyes remain untouched. And behind those eyes is a mind sharp enough to see through my disguise within minutes. She recognized you. She recognized herself. She said, 'Tell Bianca I never blamed her. It was his fire, not hers.' I could not speak. 'She is lucid,' Holmes said, 'but not safe. Pelum does not know she survived. If he did, her life would not last another day.' He rose, and with uncharacteristic softness added, 'Some truths must be uncovered, Watson. Others must be protected.' Then, as if brushing away a lingering emotion, he returned to the table and struck a match. 'Let us finish the game,' he said, 'before Lord Pelum begins his next move.' We arrived in Gloucester Terrace under a cloak of grey weather and heavier silence. Holmes walked a pace ahead, and behind him, veiled in black and clad in the stillness of resignation, came the woman I now knew as Mariana Santoro. I had offered my arm during the journey, but she had declined with a glance that neither welcomed pity nor denied dignity. Holmes paused at the garden gate. "No drama, if you please," he said softly to her, though his tone was more courtesy than command. The house was still, as if it too had anticipated what now stirred behind its walls. The maid, instructed by Holmes the day before, had been dismissed for the afternoon. Bianca opened the door, expecting only Holmes and myself. Her hand froze on the latch when she saw the figure behind him. For one breathless instant, the world stopped. Lucia and Teresa stood behind her. Neither moved. Holmes entered without preamble. "Good day, ladies. I believe this guest requires no introduction." Mariana stepped into the parlour, slow and steady. Her veil remained in place. Bianca's complexion turned ghost pale, and she clutched the back of a chair as if to steady the whole room. Teresa made a soft sound, half gasp, half prayer, while Lucia blinked once, as though doubting her own sight. Holmes looked from face to face. "There is a reckoning due," he said, "but it shall not be yours, unless you choose to make it so." Mariana said nothing. She moved to the window and placed her gloved hand on the sill. And thus the trap was sprung, not in deception, but in truth finally returned to its origin. It was Bianca who spoke first, though her voice sounded not unlike parchment rubbed thin. "You should not have brought her." Holmes, unmoved, merely replied, "Then you should not have buried her." Mariana remained silent, though I could see her shoulders had tensed. Teresa stepped forward as if to interject, but Bianca raised her hand, a gesture neither sharp nor commanding, but curiously exhausted. "She does not know," Bianca murmured, eyes on Holmes. "She cannot." Holmes tilted his head. "You forget that she is not deaf, nor dead. She simply wears what you feared to look at." At that, Mariana turned. "I know more than you think," she said, her voice calm, scarred perhaps, but intact. "I know I was loved until I became inconvenient, and I know the man who made me thus now holds your peace for ransom." Bianca's composure wavered. Lucia could hold no longer. "We thought you had died," she whispered. "After the fire, there was blood, and they told us—" Mariana's laugh was the sound of something too long buried cracking open. "They told you what was easiest, and you believed it." Holmes interjected coolly. "We have little time. Lord Pelum will be arriving shortly." Bianca's eyes widened. "You brought him here?" Holmes gave a smile of the most dangerous kind, pleasant, quiet, and absolutely prepared. "He believes he comes to collect a payment, but what he will find, I think, is a debt long overdue." It was then I noticed Bianca's hand trembling, ever so slightly, as it clutched a silver brooch pinned to her bodice. The same one Holmes had noted on her first visit. This time, it quivered like a compass brought too near a storm. Holmes produced a thin folder from beneath his coat and placed it deliberately on the centre table. The sisters regarded it as one might a ticking device of uncertain design. "Your late uncle's collection was far more comprehensive than anyone realised," he said. Among his less public holdings were several correspondences of a rather personal nature, letters between Mariana and Lord Pelum, dated, sealed, and hidden in the false panel of an escritoire. Bianca stepped back. "You opened the house." Holmes's voice was crisp. "The house was already opened, by Pelum. I simply followed." He gestured to the folder. "He has made copies. I now possess both the originals and the reproductions. His intention is clear. If you do not pay, he will publish. And if you do, he will only raise the price." Lucia's voice was faint. "He knows Mariana lives?" "Not yet," Holmes replied. "But he suspects. And if he sees her here today, the game is changed, permanently." Mariana stepped forward and touched the folder with her gloved finger. "He will not be satisfied with silence," she said. "He must be seen to win." Holmes met her gaze. "Then we shall allow him that illusion." Bianca exhaled slowly, eyes closed. "We did what we could to protect her." "No," Mariana said quietly. "You did what you could to protect yourselves." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. With grief, with guilt, with the weight of truths kept too long. And then came the sound of the outer gate creaking open. Holmes did not look up. "Right on time." Holmes stepped toward the hearth and adjusted the clock on the mantel by precisely 1 minute. He will knock twice, then hesitate. He is not a brave man, only a proud one. True to prediction, 2 sharp raps echoed through the entryway, followed by a pause. Bianca looked at Holmes. "What did you tell him?" "That the sisters would pay, if he came personally, that the price of secrecy would be met in coin." "And he believed you?" "Pride, Miss Santoro," Holmes murmured. "It erodes caution faster than greed." Holmes opened the door himself. Lord Pelum entered with the smug self-assurance of a man who thinks the worst has already been avoided. He paused when he saw the assembled group, particularly Mariana, who remained veiled. "This is unexpected," he said, his eyes narrowing. Holmes gestured. "May I present the Santoro sisters, and one whose presence you will no doubt find familiar?" Pelum's brow furrowed. "And who are you?" "A mere facilitator," Holmes replied. "But today, consider me your audience." Mariana stepped forward and with deliberate grace lifted her veil. Pelum staggered. For a moment, no one moved. You're, he began. I am not a ghost, Mariana said coldly, though you tried to make me one. Pelum turned toward Holmes, eyes blazing. You planned this. Holmes's expression remained untroubled. I forged the invitation. You brought your conscience. There was no threat in Holmes's voice, only precision. And in that moment, I saw the criminal stripped of bluster, faced not by the law, but by the one truth he could not refute, the living evidence of what he had tried to erase. There are moments when silence carries the weight of a verdict, and none was heavier than the stillness that fell as Mariana reached up with trembling fingers and lifted the veil from her face. I confess, even prepared as I was, I drew breath sharply. The scarring was not symmetrical. The left side of her face had been spared, and it retained a delicate, almost classical beauty. But the right bore the unmistakable imprint of flame. Tissue puckered and hardened, the eye rimmed in pale ridges of damage, yet defiant and alert. It was a face that had endured fire and lived to remember it. Lord Pelum staggered back a pace. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. You left me to die, Mariana said. And in those words, every tremor vanished. You locked the door behind you and told them I had run. You wrote letters in my name, changed the will, and returned to London, all so you could rise, unencumbered. Pelum recovered some measure of speech. You were raving, delusional. No one would have believed. No one needed to believe. She cut in, her voice icier than Holmes at his most clinical. You knew the timing. You knew the layout. You poured the oil yourself. Bianca took a step toward her. Mariana raised a hand. You asked me not to speak, but I was silent for too long. I wore your guilt like a shroud. She turned to Pelum. You feared scandal. You feared exposure. But I am not here for revenge. I am here because silence no longer protects us. Pelum attempted composure. This is madness. You have no proof. Holmes, who until then had merely observed, now moved forward and placed a packet upon the table. She does, he said, and so do I. Pelum's eyes darted between Holmes, the folder, and the women before him. The room had turned from parlour to courtroom, and the verdict had already arrived. Holmes opened the folder slowly, methodically, as if peeling back the skin of a long-buried truth. This, he said, lifting a half-scorched letter, was found in the fireplace of Mariana's former room in Naples. Though charred, a chemical reconstitution revealed the ink, a letter from Pelum, dated 2 days before the fire, in which he expresses concern that their understanding must end before his return to London. Pelum sneered. You read smoke and shadows. Holmes ignored the interruption. This next page, also recovered, shows a purchase made in Naples for lamp oil. The clerk remembered you well. English, tall, impatient, paid in sterling. He held up a third item, a photograph fragment. And this was intended to be all that remained of Mariana, a face destroyed, evidence erased, but the studio stamp and the angle matched the surviving half, proof of premeditation. Still Pelum said nothing. And finally, Holmes added, there is the testimony of the woman herself, your victim. She was locked in her room. She awoke to smoke. The door handle was hot. Someone had wedged it shut from the outside. He turned, folding his hands behind his back. It was not an accident. It was cowardice in flame. You feared disgrace more than guilt, and so you sought to erase it. Pelum laughed dryly. She'll never testify. Look at her. Holmes's eyes narrowed. That is the last mistake you will make. The door opened then with theatrical precision, as if timed by an unseen conductor, and in stepped Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, face set, moustache twitching with barely concealed satisfaction. I believe, he said, holding aloft a warrant, that Lord Pelum is wanted for questioning regarding attempted murder, conspiracy to pervert justice, and criminal blackmail. Pelum blanched. You have no jurisdiction. Oh, I have quite enough, Lestrade snapped, especially when provided with signed affidavits, physical evidence, and shall we say, a certain Mr. Holmes's persuasive handwriting. Holmes offered a faint smile. It is always wise to place one's pieces before the board is overturned. Pelum made a sudden dash for the hallway, but Lestrade was quicker than he looked, and a uniformed constable waiting outside barred the exit with a thud of his shoulder. "Game's up, sir," Lestrade said, clapping the cuffs with evident pleasure. "We've a quiet cell with your name on it." As Pelum was led away, he cast one last look back at Mariana, a mixture of recognition, regret, and something colder. But she did not look away. She met his gaze and held it until the door closed. Holmes adjusted his cuffs. "Justice limps, Watson, but it arrives." Bianca wept silently. Teresa held her hand, and Lucia stood rooted. And Holmes, who so rarely lingered in rooms filled with emotion, turned and said, almost gently, "Let the fire end here." It was late in the evening when we returned to Baker Street, the lamps glowing amber against the greying dusk, and Holmes once again took his accustomed seat by the hearth. He did not speak for some time, drawing thoughtfully upon his pipe, the smoke curling about his head like the mist of some ancient battlefield. "The fire in Naples," he said at last, "was no accident, Watson, but nor was it merely a crime of convenience. It was a stratagem born of desperation." I stirred in my chair. "He meant to kill her, didn't he?" "Undoubtedly, but not out of hatred. At least, not consciously. No, Lord Pelum feared scandal more than conscience. Mariana was not merely a mistress discarded. She was a witness, a memory, a potential ruination." Holmes leaned forward slightly. He saw the flames as a form of erasure. But fire, Watson, is an indiscreet accomplice. It consumes much, but not all. There are always traces. A singed note, a witness unconsulted, a photograph half preserved. It tells its own tale, even after the storyteller flees. I thought of the woman in Kensington, the way she stood despite the ruin to her face, and he left her to die. Holmes gave a short, mirthless chuckle. He locked the door and lit the match, but fate intervened. A neighbour heard coughing. A servant acted swiftly. By the time Pelum was raising a glass at his club, Mariana had been pulled from the wreckage. He reached for the newspaper and tapped it once. They called it an accident, but even accidents, when examined closely, reveal the tremor of a human hand. I said nothing more. There are crimes which, even when solved, leave the soul uneasy. And this was such a one. I had long believed, as many do, that silence in the face of evil was weakness, or at best, fear. But Holmes had a different theory, as he expounded that night while the coals burned low. "You see, Watson," he began, "when Mariana returned from Naples, it was not to demand retribution, but sanctuary. Her sisters, Bianca in particular, did not hesitate." "But why conceal her?" I asked. "Why not go to the authorities at once?" Holmes smiled thinly. "Because they understood what society would do with the truth. Mariana, already damaged in the eyes of a hypocritical world, would be made a spectacle. Her injuries would become gossip. Her past a weapon. Justice, in this case, might have offered only further suffering." "But Holmes," I protested, "surely it is a greater crime to let a man like Pelum walk free." "It is," he said, "and yet they weighed that against the dignity of their sister and chose to protect what remained. Their silence was not cowardice, but love, imperfect, perhaps, but sincere." He rose and paced the room. "They knew he would return. The kind of man who trades in secrets cannot resist the scent of panic. They waited, watched, and when the moment came, they reached out to me. And so you set the trap." "I simply gave truth a path. It was their choice in the end to break the silence." There was something in his tone, not quite admiration, not quite judgment, that suggested Holmes saw in the Santoro sisters a kind of tragic strength, the sort he rarely encountered and never dismissed lightly. "It is a rare thing, Watson," he murmured, "for love to choose quiet over applause." It was not until much later, as I sat reviewing my notes, that Holmes offered his final analysis of the case, and with it an insight into Bianca Santoro's inner world that I confess had eluded me. "You noticed," he said, "how pale she grew when Mariana spoke. That was not merely shock, it was guilt. Not for the fire, mind you, but for the silence that followed it." "She wished to speak?" I asked. "At first, yes, but she was the eldest, and her sense of duty warred with her conscience. Teresa and Lucia deferred to her. She made the decision, and the burden stayed with her." He poured himself a second cup of tea, a gesture that in Holmes signified unusual introspection. "For 2 years," he continued, "Bianca lived with the knowledge that the man who had tried to kill her sister was free, untarnished, and very likely profiting from his crime. She watched the post with dread, flinched at any mention of Naples, and feared above all that Mariana would one day reproach her." "But Mariana did not," I said softly. "No, and therein lay the deeper wound. Guilt, Watson, thrives in silence, especially when forgiven. It festers, it whispers that one is unworthy of the very mercy extended." He stood, drawing the curtains against the evening's growing chill. "Bianca was not weak, but she was afraid, not of Pelum, but of herself, of what she had failed to do. And so she reached out to you." "At last," Holmes nodded. "Not to protect Mariana, but to confess, in the only way she could, that she wished the silence to end. There are, I have come to believe, many kinds of courage. Bianca's was a quiet kind, brittle, delayed, but no less real for that." It was only once Lord Pelum had departed in handcuffs that Holmes allowed himself the faintest air of satisfaction, and even then it lasted no more than the length of a single cigarette. "You may recall, Watson," he said, "that when you examined the brooch retrieved from the ashen coat, you noticed a curious flattening on one side." "I did," I replied, "though I confess I made little of it." "Quite understandably," Holmes said with an arched brow. "It had been pressed against a metal clasp, one fastened not to the garment, but to a folded letter tucked into the inner lining. A letter from Mariana to Pelum, dated 2 days before the fire." I blinked. "But surely that would have been destroyed." "Nearly," he nodded. "But I recovered it, or rather, what was left of it. Miss Lucia, in her quiet efficiency, had salvaged several half-burned papers, thinking them unrelated. Among them was a browned scrap that stank of camphor and regret. Its ink had vanished, of course, but with a reagent of my own design, a blend of gallate and iodine, I restored the imprint." Holmes rose and fetched a slip of paper from the mantel. Even in its restored state, the message was tremblingly faint, but legible. "You said it would never be spoken of again," I read. "You said fire was final." "Indeed," Holmes murmured, "and in that single sentence lies motive, memory, and the presumption of impunity." He replaced the note in its envelope. "Fire may erase the surface, Watson, but the pressure of a desperate hand, that it seems, leaves deeper traces." It was one of those moments in which Holmes' brilliance seemed less like intellect and more like conjuring, or perhaps, as he himself might say, merely observation sharpened by purpose. "But the glove," I said, "how could that possibly have exposed him?" Holmes gave a slight smile. "Ah, yes, the glove. It is always the seemingly minor article that upends a castle of lies." He gestured to the leather piece lying upon his desk, immaculate at first glance, but marred by a single brownish stain at the base of the thumb. "You'll note," he said, "that the stain is not at the palm, where one might expect soot or ash, but precisely at the point where a flame held low would catch if one were lighting a wick inside a confined space." "A lamp," Holmes nodded. A paraffin lantern, one which had been tampered with to appear faulty, so that it might explode upon being lit. The timing of the fire, the manner of its spread, and the distortion of the glass shards all point to such a device. He turned the glove over. But this was vanity. Pelum returned to the scene before he fled Naples, and he retrieved only what he deemed valuable. His gloves, embroidered with his crest. He discarded the one that bore evidence, but he did so carelessly. And the brooch? I asked. A red herring, or rather, a red reminder. He left it pinned to the damaged coat deliberately, a calculated move to suggest Mariana's consent, but he misjudged the sisters. They preserved it not as symbol of romance, but as proof of betrayal. He stood, hands behind his back. The brooch told me he wished to rewrite the tale. The glove told me he had lit the match. But it was his posture, the stiffness in his left shoulder, that told me where he kept the original letters. Fear, Watson, is a master tailor. It alters a man's very spine. That evening, I found myself watching Holmes more closely than usual, searching for some flicker of emotional residue. But as ever, he remained a sphinx with a violin, silent, deliberate, composed. Still, I could not shake the weight that clung to the room. There is something wretched about it all, I confessed. To solve a case is one thing, but to see so much sorrow beneath the ash. Holmes stirred, but did not answer immediately. I suppose, I continued, that truth does not always redeem. Sometimes it merely explains. Holmes finally looked up. You are correct, Watson. Truth is no balm. It is a blade, and its edge is indiscriminate. It cuts both deceiver and deceived. He leaned back, fingers steepled. There was once a Roman senator who argued that fire was divine punishment, that it alone could cleanse what men would not confess. I disagree. Fire may destroy the physical, but memory, Watson, is flame's reluctant twin. It lingers long after the smoke clears. I was struck by the solemnity in his tone. Not grief, not even empathy, but a kind of philosophical fatigue, as though even he could not fully extricate himself from the ashes of this tale. Will they be all right, do you think? I asked, meaning the sisters. They will persist, he said simply. And sometimes, Watson, that is the highest form of survival. He picked up his violin, tuning it absently. The case is concluded, the facts are laid bare, but truth, real truth, lingers like a scent. You may never catch it fully, but you will always know it passed through. And in that moment, I felt as though Holmes had not merely explained a crime, but had traced the outline of something far older. A sorrow born not of what was lost, but of what could never quite be named. The next morning was as ordinary as any in Baker Street. The milk left at the step, the dull clatter of hoofs below, the Times folded with surgical precision. Holmes stood by the fireplace, the flames now reduced to a soft glow. Without turning, he said, "There are two forces, Watson, that shape a man, memory and fire." I looked up from my chair. Which is stronger? He tapped his pipe thoughtfully against the mantel. Memory may haunt, but fire consumes, he said. Yet only one of them leaves ashes. And with that, he turned from the hearth, retrieved his newspaper, and vanished behind its pages, as if the embers of one mystery had already given way to the next. It was a peculiar stillness that greeted us that morning in Baker Street. Not the stillness of peace, but of aftermath, as though the room itself had absorbed some portion of sorrow and had yet to exhale it. Holmes sat with his back half turned to me, his lean frame curved slightly over the hearth, where the coals muttered softly. The scent of the sea had long since departed his coat, but something of the southern wind, the wind that had stirred the curtains in Naples and carried the whisper of a woman's voice, seemed to remain about him. I dared not disturb his thoughts. There were rare occasions when Holmes appeared less a man than a barometer of human complexity, calibrated not by pressure or mercury, but by memory. And today, he was unusually quiet. The violin rested untouched on its stand. Instead, Holmes toyed absently with a pipe that had long gone cold. Outside, the bells of St. Pancras gave the hour, but he did not move. It was only after a long silence that he spoke, softly, almost absently, as though to the fire itself. They loved her differently, he murmured, but neither could bear to bury her entirely. I leaned forward, puzzled. You mean Mariana? He gave the slightest nod, eyes still fixed on the flame. Then, almost inaudibly, he added, La verità è figlia del tempo. It hung in the air like incense, foreign, fragrant, and unfinished. I don't believe I know the phrase, I said. You do now, Holmes replied, finally turning his gaze to me. It's an old Italian proverb. Truth is the daughter of time. He did not elaborate, but the meaning took root as surely as if he had written it across the window pane. Time, I thought. Time that erodes concealment, that lifts the veil from even the most careful lies. Time that returned Mariana to us, not in flesh, but in flame and whisper and ruin. And I realized, not for the first time, that Holmes rarely translated such things for me. He preferred, I think, to let understanding dawn of its own accord, as the best truths often do. After a pause, I asked, But Holmes, was this justice? He raised an eyebrow. I mean, I continued, Lord Pelum will face consequences, yes, but Mariana is still gone, the sisters shattered. Was this truly justice, or merely consolation dressed in deduction? Holmes studied me for a moment, then gave a slight smile, that thin, elusive expression I had come to associate with private satisfaction and public restraint. Justice, he said, is a limping constable, late to the scene, and often clutching the wrong suspect, but if given clear directions, he does eventually arrive. I chuckled despite myself. Holmes continued, What we did, Watson, was restore the narrative, not to comfort, but to correct. They will mourn her still, but now they will mourn the truth. He struck a match and lit the pipe that had, until then, remained unkindled. The smoke rose in slow spirals, mingling with the soft light. There are those who think justice is a sword, he added, but more often it is simply a lantern, and the flame must be protected if it is to reach the dark. And with that, he fell silent again, the pipe drawing rhythmically between his fingers. I might have pressed further, but Holmes had already shifted his attention to the newspaper on his lap. Curious, he murmured. I glanced up. Another murder? Worse, he replied, tapping the paper. A clergyman in Surrey claims his sermons are being plagiarized by a ghost. I blinked. A ghost? So he insists, said Holmes, a gleam returning to his eye. The matter involves locked drawers, identical homilies, and a bishop with an inconvenient memory. Quite ghastly. You don't actually believe? Of course not. But belief, my dear Watson, is never a prerequisite for investigation. In fact, the best cases begin precisely where belief falters. He stood, folding the paper with crisp precision. Well then, I said, rising too, shall we? Holmes slipped into his coat, that familiar half-smile now in full bloom. Yes, Watson, the ashes have cooled. Let's chase ghosts. And with that, the case of the Neapolitan sisters was quietly shelved. Not forgotten, but filed among those Holmes considered complete, if never quite closed. Holmes remained seated by the hearth, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes half closed in thought. It is curious, Watson, he murmured at last, how often the most corrosive lies are not those spoken aloud, but those left to smoulder in silence. I watched him, still wrestling with the emotional wreckage this case had left behind. And yet, I said, she chose concealment over justice. She chose dignity, Holmes corrected gently, and perhaps in doing so saved what remained of her soul. Not all truths heal when aired. Some, like ash, only scatter. He turned the page of his paper. The matter apparently closed in his mind. but the weight of his words remained. What do you think? Was silence the nobler choice, or did justice deserve to speak, no matter the cost? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I am always curious how each of you would have handled such a case. And if you enjoy these mysteries, be sure to subscribe for more adventures with Sherlock Holmes. And don't forget to pass the story along to a fellow detective.